Okay, very good. I think we can get started. So a warm welcome to everyone joining this call today. It's great to have you all on the line. My name is Anherad Lang. I'm the Executive Director of PHAP, that's short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. I'm delighted to be serving once again as your host today for this webinar entitled Community-Based Protection, Early Warning, and Conflict Preparedness. It's organized by PHAP and NRC, and this is the second event in a two-part series of events on civilian safety in armed conflict, in which we are exploring different programs aimed at preventing physical harm to civilians in conflict situations. Now, before we start the substance of the session today, I'd like to explain very briefly just a few technical aspects of the platforms that we can all get the most out of this experience together today. First of all, importantly, interpretation is available in English, French, and Spanish. Please, if you haven't done so already, do select your preferred language using the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. If you encounter any issues with the platform throughout the event, we are also providing video backup live streams in English, French, and Spanish, as well as an audio-only live stream in English. Those are found at the following URLs that you see on the screen now, and they were also shared in the email that you received with the event connection instructions. My colleague will also be happy to share those in the chat now and at any time during the event. So if you have a problem during the event, just mention that quickly in the chat and she can repost those links for you so you can jump over to the backup live stream. So as participants today, you can take part in the discussion in the chat, of course, as well as in the Q&A. In the Zoom platform here, we have the chat button to open the chat window. Please, as we're in Zoom, please do remember to click on to and select everyone so that everyone in the event can see your chat message, not just the panelists. So please do click on to and select everyone when you're using the chat. You can also use the Q&A button to submit questions to the speakers. Note that you do have the option to submit your questions or comments anonymously by clicking the Send Anonymously checkbox. If you're following the live stream, you can type your question or your comment in the session chat there. And finally, you can also participate on Twitter using the hashtag civilian safety. So with that, we will turn to today's event. In armed conflict, civilians continue to be heavily affected, of course, we know. The safety of civilians is often ignored or it's not addressed, and at times civilians are purposely targeted by parties to a conflict. And I know that many of you are struggling with those kinds of dynamics in your work. We had a lot of questions and comments coming in before the events about such difficulties. Protection services provide much needed support to vulnerable and marginalized groups and individuals and respond to protection concerns with remedial service provision, but humanitarian actors have overall had less success with helping to ensure civilians' safety in armed conflict. This webinar series is being organized to help us get a better idea of what prevention looks like within our protection of civilians programming. In our event last week, we heard from a panel sharing their experiences of programs focusing on the direct prevention of violence through advocacy, through armed actor behavior change, and through direct engagement with armed actors. Now, in today's session, we're going to change somewhat our focus and we'll be discussing programs aiming to strengthen communities in conflict-affected areas to reduce the risk of harm and mitigate the effects of armed conflict on civilian populations. So through this, we hope to provide you with an overview of some of the strategies and programming options followed by organizations to help prevent violence against civilians, and through this to inform how you approach your programming in your own organizations. We're joined by 4 speakers today to help us do this by providing their perspectives from their organization's work in this area. I'd like to introduce them now. We have joining us first Helen Adamu Balami, National Armed Violence Reduction Manager with the Danish Refugee Council in Nigeria, who will be speaking about their programming to improve community safety and conflict preparedness in Northeast Nigeria. We're also, welcome, Helen. Let's just do a final check of your audio and also welcome you on the line if you want to say a quick hello.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Great to have you with us as well, Helen. And now let's turn to Nils. We'd like to welcome Nils Carstensen, Senior Humanitarian Advisor with Local to Global Protection, L2GP. He'll be telling us about the Survivor and Community-Led Crisis Response Program in Sudan. Great to have you as well on the line, Nils.
And thank you very much. And thanks a lot for inviting me.
Our pleasure. And now I'd like to welcome Cesar Nagango Lumu, Protection Program Manager with SOPROP, who will be telling us about their organization's community-based protection programming in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Welcome, Cesar.
Bonjour.
Bonjour, and warm
Good
welcome
morning.
to you. Thanks for joining. And last but not least, I would like to welcome Rasmus Sandvold Veschke, advisor with Norwegian People's Aid, who will be talking about their conflict preparedness and protection programming. Warm welcome to you, Rasmus.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Great. Excellent. So thanks so much, all of you, for joining today, for giving your time. We're going to start by going around the panel to get a brief overview of the 4 programs that our presenters will be introducing and the kinds of situations where they are applied. We'll then proceed through the event, looking at specific success stories, then looking at lessons learned that we can highlight that can potentially be applied by other organizations. And then finally, looking at how these programs fit into the wider humanitarian architecture or ecosystem, if you will. But now, as we get going, please do at any time submit any questions you have for the panelists, as we will be trying to pick up some of your questions throughout. We won't try to save them all for the end. So anything that comes to your mind, please do send those in at any time. Good. So starting with you, Rasmus, can you tell us what the Conflict Preparedness and Protection Program is and how it aims to promote civilian safety in conflicts? Over to you, Rasmus.
Thank you very much. And thanks for that introduction. I think what was said here in the introduction about there being a protection gap in modern conflicts is exactly what led the Norwegian People's Aid, or NPA, to develop the Conflict Preparedness and Protection Program. So to get straight to the point, Conflict Preparedness and Protection seeks to empower civilians with knowledge and appropriate tools so that they are better prepared and protected from explosive weapons in particular, but also other conflict-related threats. NPA does this program by training and equipping civilians in places that are subject to conflict or prone to violent conflict. And I will get back to some details and some examples also in the next section, but let me concentrate a bit on the background of this program. Because CPP, or Conflict Preparedness and Protection, was born out of a recognition that in order to better achieve one of NPA's missions, which is protecting civilians from explosive weapons, we needed to work more before and during conflicts. Because for those who know Norwegian People's Aid, you may be familiar with our work in mine action, which is one of the pillars of our international work. And that is basically about removing unexploded devices, such as landmines, improvised explosives, or IEDs, cluster munitions, or other remnants of war. And we've been doing that for more than 25 years, clearing remnants after conflict. But we know that people are killed and injured in great numbers, of course, after the fighting has ended due to these remnants of war. But we also know that this clearance effort often takes place only after the conflict has ceased. So there's a need for the fighting to have ceased actually before such work can start. But with modern conflicts being long-lasting, complex, and often urbanized, and with explosives or explosive weapons with wide area effects being used in densely populated areas, we in NPA, we saw a need to address this protection challenge deriving from exactly ongoing conflicts and how to mitigate the impacts on civilians. So I mentioned that the numbers, or did I mention that already? But at least the numbers of people injured during conflict from explosive weapons is much higher than the number injured or the casualty numbers we have post-conflict. So we know from the last 10 years of recording casualties, not us in NPA, but other organizations have been engaged in this work, that 90% of those killed or injured by explosive weapons in towns and cities have been civilians, 90%. So this points to the particularities of fighting and using explosive weapons in urban areas. And we also know that many weapons that are used in modern conflicts were never designed to be used in densely populated areas, exactly because they have wide area impacts. They are either too large or too imprecise to be able to hit military targets in cities without also causing extensive damage to civilian infrastructure and, of course, harming and killing civilians on impact. So this conflict preparedness and protection program is our sort of operational response to this challenge of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, to which we also have a policy response that I will get back to later. But yeah, the bottom line being that we saw no reason to consider these very high numbers of civilian casualties as inevitable consequences of warfare. But yeah, we're trying to mitigate some of these by helping people to protect themselves better. So yeah, with that, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Rasmus. And next, I'd like to turn to Helen. As I understand it, you'll be telling us about DRC's protection programming in Northeast Nigeria. What is your approach there? Over to you, Helen.
Okay, thank you. So I'll be introducing DRC humanitarian disarmament and peace building approach, within which we work to support communities through building on their visions, concerns, and capacities to be able to mitigate tension and conflict across different regions and countries, and here in the Northeast Nigeria. We support through collaborative community-led processes like community safety planning, conflict management, and different processes, while building trust and relation among different stakeholders, which I'll later elaborate in the due course of the presentation. Our approach as DRC, we see that this approach is relevant, ranging from armed conflict situations, displacement, humanitarian emergency contexts, recovery, and returns. And it's successful with conflict sensitivity in our approach, looking at it as key, because we learn and adapt to the local context while we maintain our presence in communities where we work. And then creating an enabling environment where people feel safe to share and learn their experiences, while promoting transparency and clear communication vis-a-vis among all stakeholders. Over to you.
Great, thank you very much. And now to provide us with another example of community-based protection, I'd like to turn next to Cesar. Cesar, could you tell us briefly about how you have designed your programming in the Democratic Republic of the Congo? You have the floor, Cesar.
Je vous remercie pour la parole.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I'd like to present you our approach to community protection in the DRC. It's particularly in the eastern area of the country. This approach is rolled out in Masisi, and the aim is to help the targeted communities to prevent and also respond to conflict, and also to support the local communities when it comes to protection issues. In order to reach these objectives, we are going through various program steps. The first of these is linked to selecting the communities that we really want to target. We organize general meetings with these communities after that, and we actually set up protection strategies with the communities within these local areas. After we've set these up, we then organize the different skills building sessions with these communities, and we base these around protection themes. The idea is to really go deep into these themes and look at how these can be really rolled out among the communities themselves, raising awareness among local people with regard to their rights and to the issues in question. We are also setting up community protection plans where we identify protection risks that are particularly frequent in the communities in question, so that we can develop together with local authorities to actually put measures in place. We create also exit plans. The idea, therefore, is to help all the stakeholders involved in communities to actually come together. So we bring in the authorities, we bring in community leaders, and the idea is to actually work together to look at their own exit strategy within a community level. We look at who's going to do what after the project has come to an end. We have these community protection structures, therefore, SPCs, and we also work together with what we call peace and development clusters or nuclei. We actually use these groups to actually do mediation at a community level. The idea is to raise awareness, look at the different members of the community who might be involved, and also examine land rights. So the idea is to really look at whether there can be a solution put forward on a local level. If not, we can go to a regional level, and we can look therefore at how advocacy networks can be set up with members of local associations. The idea is to really look at who is active within particular areas. So the Masisi territory, for example, we're organising roundtables on a territorial level at the moment, so that the issues can be really put on the table and discussed. And then this can go up to provincial level, and we can look at who can organise meetings, round tables with individuals involved at this level, and how we can create further advocacy actions at the provincial level. The idea, therefore, is to really go up from very local grassroots level up to provincial level, depending on the problems and depending on whether the solutions can be found within the entities involved. In addition to these activities, we're also organising follow-up work at the moment linked to the recommendations that have been put forward by local authorities and by other individuals during our meetings. We are looking at how far the various commitments have been met now, and if there are commitments that haven't been met, what can we do to identify the reasons why, and then what can we therefore put in place to try to remedy this. We look at the various threats to which the populations are exposed in the different entities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cesar. And now for our fourth approach we'll be discussing in this webinar, I'd like to turn now to Nils. Nils, could you tell us what the survivor and community-led crisis response approach is and how it works to improve the safety of civilians? Nils, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot. And indeed, I'm happy to try to at least give it a shot. I think I should preface that with saying local to global protection is not an NGO per se. We're not really doers. We're more like a knowledge plugin that supports local national NGOs, working with international NGOs, ultimately donors, but first and foremost, communities and citizens and what they do. So when I refer to we do or whatever, it's not me. It's what community members, it's what citizens are doing. Our part in all of this is to support and facilitate processes, but all the implementation belongs to the communities, community members, and the local national NGOs we're working in support of. So I think that's just important for me to stress. So survivor and community-led crisis responses is basically a way of working that stems from, I think, something we all intuitively understand, that that what contributes hugely to people's protection, survival, and recovery in best cases is to a very large extent their own efforts. So that's our basic assumption. We have over 10 years working in many different crises and in countries with a whole host of local, national, and international partners developed this way of working. We continue to do so. It's basically aimed to achieve much of what some of my colleagues have already pointed to, but maybe in a slightly, that's what I'd like to believe, radical manner, go in and support what people are already doing. So supporting citizens and communities to identify their own priorities. Which challenges or threats do they want to address themselves? Use their own experience plus new ideas, but whatever skills they would like to seek from outside to basically implement their own activities. That often includes small micro grants, etc. So we are basically devising a way of working where a lot of the actual doing and the ownership over that, including the funding, lies with community groups. Now, that's quite a complicated process. And as we also try to work and stay in keeping with humanitarian principles, lots of guidance. I'm going to spare you from all of that. Just put a link in the chat in a little while to our website where you can find all the guidance documentations around how we, in collaborations with community volunteers, local national NGOs, go about doing this. What we have seen is that this way of working, because it's so much more radically surrenders the decision-making and the control over resources and the direction of the interventions to community members, it pays off quite a lot in terms of real sense of ownership. And up comes a wealth of ideas. So we've also seen that this has, in many cases, in some cases, have started at the height of a conflict, where a lot of the activities that community groups then took on of their own were a lot about preparedness around, for instance, safety during bombardment, digging foxholes, teaching kids to lie down instead of run when they hear the airplane, that very, very nitty-gritty basic survival and protection. But then as the conflict changed, maybe became less intense, more on livelihoods, hunger, etc. The interventions that the groups choose fanned out to cover basic education, access to health, etc. So it's a very organic way of working where we do not decide when we start whether this is going to be about what you would call protection or it's going to be about livelihoods. That is ultimately up to the communities to decide. What we do see is that in most all cases where we have worked, there are either direct or indirect, very prominent examples of this way of working delivering to protection. As we probably all know, most people who are living through a crisis do not make these distinctions between what is protection, what is survival, what is long-term, it's these silos are ours, and they have often very little root. So this way of working kind of allows us to sidestep all of that sort of specialized, professionalized silo thinking and go with what community activists decide to do. I should say it's a way of working that works well. It's not intended as a substitute to what a lot of what more mainstream, more outside-led interventions. It's very much a supplement. So it, for instance, works extremely well alongside household cash distributions, or it could work well alongside more specialized protection interventions. But it's not, and that's important to say, it's not intended to be a substitute, but it's an addition that opens up for a different, qualitatively often different way of collaboration between community members, local NGOs and international NGOs, which will then subsequently also actually enrich much of the more traditional programming. That's at least our experience across Myanmar, Sudan, Palestine, Philippines, etc. That this has a way of, in a good way, challenging some of the power dynamics also between us as NGOs and communities, and somehow open up a constructive renegotiation of that relationships. I think I will just probably leave it there and then put into the chat to you all the link so you can go and see in much more detail, because I could probably just go on for the next 20 minutes talking about how to do this.
Very good. That sounds excellent. Thanks so much for the introduction. Very helpful, and absolutely anything you can share in the chat as well, that would be much appreciated. So let's continue on to our next section. We have had a few questions come in, but people are in many cases really asking about examples, asking about effectiveness. So I think it would be useful actually to move right along and get into the more concrete examples that were prepared here. So now that we have some idea of the programs that we are discussing today, I'd like to go around the panel, as I mentioned, to ask if there's a particular concrete success story that you'd like to share that shows how this kind of programming can work in practice. So we'll go around again, but in a different order. So let's go first over to Helen for a success story from DRC's programming in Northeast Nigeria. Helen, you have the floor.
So this is one of the different dialogue processes for DRC approach, community and security providers dialogue. The first photograph depicting a community setting which have fled from the insurgency and now at a recovery stage. So to encourage, to build relations and enhance trust building between the security providers and the community people, where they come together to share their concerns and also the need for sharing relevant information for preparedness to mitigate any suspicious movement or activity within their communities. What has changed for these communities is that during the insurgency in the Northeast Nigeria, there has been hunters and vigilantes who have now been recognized as semi-formal local security providers, which we also promote that relation building between them and the formal security providers, and trying to share relevant information for the protection of their communities, as well as the security providers also understanding those gaps within the local security providers to be able to build their capacity in how to respond effectively when transmitting information to them. And the second picture depicts a camp setting, which is different from a community setting, where people that have fled from from insurgents and are now in an environment where they feel there are certain safety issues that affect them, but there was not an opportunity for such a fora, which our engagement was one of its kind for them, where they share their concerns, having fled from their communities to a camp, and then having the opportunity to have a dialogue with the formal security providers. The local security providers have also shown some concerns where they feel there is less presence of security providers around, which has also made them in trying to fill in the gap by providing some certain forms of security around for the people in the camp. And during the engagement, they also did place a request to the security providers for a female police officer, if that would be available, so that it can support in addressing women's issues around the camp, which that has also been taken note of, and it's in line with what the police have taken as part of the commitment to see if they can provide that certain service to support the displaced persons in the camp. Over to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Helen. Next, we'll be looking at an example from Palestine. Turning to you, Rasmus, how has the CPP program been implemented there? You have the floor.
Thanks. Actually, the Conflict Preparedness and Protection, or CPP program, was partly born out of the experiences from the last big war in Gaza in 2015, where we saw that thousands of civilians were killed or injured, and many of those by secondary effects of explosions. We learned, for example, from doctors working in hospitals there that a huge number of casualties came from exactly those type of fragmentation injuries. And secondary fragmentation means fragmentations from buildings, etc., being blown up. And we thought that such injuries may be possible to prevent if people conduct, for example, certain techniques to lay down, etc. So we also know that the Gaza Strip has been hit by various types of explosive weapons during the last years, ranging from ad hoc fighting to armed conflict situation settings. And we also know that escaping the Gaza Strip is rather hard or impossible, and wars and conflict have a particularly devastating consequence for civilians living there, and they are basically left to fend for themselves. So in order to mitigate these effects of potential future conflict on civilians in Gaza, we have trained school teachers, public school teachers, as CPP trainers, and provided them with training aids and the materials they need in order for them, and the knowledge, of course, in order for them to pass on this information to their students. And working with children has, of course, particular challenges, so we don't limit the approach to only working with children, but the same CPP trainers offer the training to parents as well, of course, in an adapted manner. So because we acknowledge that, of course, parents are decision makers and children don't lead any household, so the whole family should have this knowledge, and we think that this knowledge being incorporated into the whole family is a huge advantage. So we basically teach basic safety messages such as preparing the home, identifying the safest parts of a building or your apartment, identifying dangerous items, practicing safety positions, basic fire safety, knowing that fires is often a consequence after explosions. We focus on what to do before, during, and immediately after an attack. We also have some basic first aid and for example, safer evacuations. How can you leave your building? Can you go to a safe spot? How to kind of reconnect with your family again afterwards? There are lots of practical measures that one can think of in mitigating the consequences of a potential conflict. Thanks. I'll leave it there.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn now to an example from Cesar. What can successful implementation of your programming in the DRC look like? Over to you, Cesar.
Merci pour la parole.
Thank you very much. So the first level of protection, as I said before, within Masisi territory is linked to the fact that we have conflicts over land as well as some of the other ongoing issues. So we've actually tried to target 6 particular communities for our actions. And among these 6 communities, there's one particular community that we felt was particularly affected by these land rights issues. So lack of access to land for the local populations. So we have a particular nuclei, an NPD, called NPD Tunda, which has worked specifically on these land rights issues. We've looked, therefore, at the safety situation and the land rights situation within these local areas, and looked specifically at the issue of cattle looting. We've seen that this has been a real issue in this metropolitan area of Catal in particular. So we've seen that over 200 cows were looted within this area, and we looked within our NPD at the facts and came up with 2 hypotheses linked to the causes of this. So the idea was that it could be linked to a settling of scores by the former occupants of the found land, so before the land rights were acquired by new buyers or owners. And the second possible cause was the lack of access to land for populations who are living near to the farms, because these populations are very agriculture based. Agriculture accounts for more than 90% of their occupations and their sources of income. So after this analysis, the members of the NPD began a series of advocacy and negotiation activities with the owners of the farms. They organised sessions, therefore, to negotiate with them, to try to convince them to facilitate the access to land, particularly a specific portion of this land for populations who needed it, local people. So they had a space for their agriculture, and this would try to mitigate this issue of lack of access to land. So there were 6 sessions of this type organised, 6 meetings during just 1 year in 2020. And during these meetings, we actually succeeded in convincing the landowners. The landowners, therefore, actually made over 183 hectares of land for the local people to cultivate under sharecropping agreements. A total of 122 farmers, therefore, including 48 women, gained access to land thanks to the negotiations between the members of NPD Tunda and the landowners. So this was a real success within the Tunda area in the Catal community, the Catal wider area. So this is my example. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Cesar. And finally, now I'd like to turn to Nils to hear an example of how the survivor and community-led crisis response has been implemented in Sudan. Over to you, Nils.
Thank you. This particular initiative or process I'll be speaking about has been running since 2011, when war broke out again in a part of Sudan, South Kordofan, or that particular part of South Kordofan called the Nuba Mountains. And it's maybe important to understand that since then, basically, this area has been sealed off from the rest of Sudan, with the then Omar al-Bashir government blockading aid, etc., and access into the area. There were a few aid entities, mostly local national NGOs or local NGOs from the area, with a little bit from outside support that continued working. And I think we can move on. Marcus, this would give you the second, the setting. It's a very mountainous area. And that's where communities began this sort of basically looking at, they had been in a war before. So looking back when the new war started, what had helped us survive in the old war? So it was basically our role in all of that was supporting communities in systematically exploring their own experience, and then taking the best bits of that, add a bit of new, and then spread it. And this simply happened by volunteers, mostly young people, walking from village to village and hosting small seminars with what then became small protection groups in each village, with a lot of women involved, and eventually, whether by design or default, still not really quite sure, the women came to play a very prominent part. So sometimes we talk about women-led protection when we talk about the protection, the hardcore protection elements against aerial bombardments, fighting, displacement, many of the things we also heard from some of the other colleagues. As the conflict moved on, it was also clear that as successful as this was in reducing the number of casualties, etc., obviously it couldn't stop the terror from the bombardment, from the war, etc. So alongside this intervention grew some of the protection groups, merged with local conflicts, peacemakers or conflict resolution activists, and that work has then grown since. Now, this is not so much about trying to address the national conflict. This is very localized because, as you would know from many other, you may have a conflict at a national level, at a state level, and then you have all the nitty-gritty, as Cesar was pointing to, conflicts over grazing, over cattle, over raiding, all those things. So this very local level conflict transformation work is probably the best work, was directed at that level and trying to, in a sense, and successfully over time, build on the connectors, mutual shared interest in reestablishing trade, in trying to chase up and resolve conflicts over raiding, etc. Cattle was taken back, so conflicts were resolved. So over time, we've seen that work over more than 10 years actually has paid off in terms of protection more than any sort of specialized protection programming. It's paid off more in terms of improving livelihoods because it has reduced that local level on conflict very, very considerably. The national level conflict sort of out of reach. It has, by chance, also reduced very significantly over the last couple of years. And that allowed also to this local level peace work to spread across front lines, reestablish trade. Some of it was done very deftly in the beginning. Both sides, there are people whose life depends on cattle and camels. So veterinary drugs that were available on the sort of the rebel side of front lines were made available through personal contacts to the other sides. That kind of opened the ears, and from that grew a dialogue that then eventually also led to reestablishing of trade, a trade which has always been there traditionally, but broken down because of the national war and some of these more local conflicts. So reestablishing that trade was extremely significant in improving, both in terms of protection, but also in terms of just simply improving the humanitarian situation overall, because trade could be reestablished. I did a little looking into it some years ago, and we were astonished at the volume, the value of that trade when it began again, very quietly, very discreetly. This all happened sort of more in an understanding between local leaders, local commanders, imams, pastors, that level, not with the national authorities. It's actually happened very much sort of quietly, almost secretly. And just echoing something, I think you pointed to it also, Cesar, the most important factor in this has been persistence. We could not have done it as outsiders. These are connects between people who may have known each other for 10, 20, 30 years. There are family linkages, etc. It's building on all of those connectors and then having a continued, basically a daily contact and dialogue. So now there are peace committees who are overseeing many of these sort of crossing points on the front lines for trade. They meet every day so that they can handle conflicts, because conflicts continue to erupt. This is not the last cow that was ever stolen in South Kordofan, nor the last camel. And so the trick is all about, and what has really paid off in terms of protection has been establishing these forums that can manage that low-level conflict that has had a huge impact on people's livelihood and safety. Even at times where nobody could really address what happened at the national level, there was still a lot of value in maintaining this dialogue. I just can't appreciate enough the work done day by day by these peace committees. And I can also, again, only stress that outside conflict experts, peace experts, etc., they have had a role to play in training and dialogue and mentoring, but it's only the peace activists from across the front lines who have made this possible and continue to this very day. Some of the most crucial access roads can only be kept open because of this work. I think I would leave it here for now.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. Now we have a lot of questions that have come in. I'm going to do a couple of rounds of questions now before we move on to the next section. I think this opportunity to hear from all of you some really concrete examples has certainly inspired some great discussion in the chat, and again some really good questions coming in. So let me turn first to Cesar. We have a question that came in via the live stream. A participant asking, how are the communities that are in need of protection identified? So Cesar, do you have something briefly that you can share from your experience in response to that question? Over to you.
Okay, merci pour la question.
Thank you very much for the question. So first, I would say that there are criteria that we establish in advance, and among these we have firstly accessibility within communities. This could be a physical accessibility issue, or it could also be linked to security within the communities. In addition to this, there's also the issue of beneficiaries. So we have to look at who are the beneficiaries within the communities, how are these selected, and also how the presence of services is actually organized. So when it comes to protection issues, we have to look at who are responsible and which services are actually there on the ground. The issue of vulnerability is also important when we look at the communities with which we work. So we look at risks and protection to try to actually identify the specific problems within each community. So what conflicts are going on within the communities themselves, and then what are the issues behind this? So for example, no access to land. This was one of the issues that we identified, and this was at the root of some of the conflicts. The presence of displaced people in various entities is also something that does create issues. So we've looked at this and how we actually tackle these issues within the communities, how they talk about it, what we can do at that level. We then look at how we can actually bring members of these communities together to really put forward their own problems and talk about their concerns. And so when we identify issues on a local level, we want to have ideally solutions that are coming up and being put forward on a local level, and build skills, capacity in terms of actually being able to put forward solutions. So we feel that the communities need to actually have a voice to become more and more resilient and to actually be able to put forward their own ideas in the context of these issues that have been identified. They can therefore have links and have a dialogue with authorities that are responsible for protecting the populations. If these problems cannot be resolved on a local level, the idea is to then escalate this on a territorial level so that we can actually bring the problems up at a higher level forum, so that the decision-making powers can actually act on these issues, and we can try to really find a solution at that higher level. So the idea is to identify these issues and to try to work out what can be done on the community level. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Cesar. Very helpful indeed. I have a question now from Nils. This has come in from Sylvia, who writes, "We often assume that civilians are, quote, caught in the crossfire in conflict, but in some places, civilians are actually the target and they cannot negotiate with armed actors, state or non-state. So what could protection look like in these situations?" Over to you, Nils.
Ooh, I'm quiet because I don't like speaking to something that I'm not quite sure. I can easily speak to it if I knew a particular contact. Maybe what I was trying to maybe communicate before was that even in situations where a dialogue or any way of influencing an armed actor, a government or a non-state armed actor or a criminal gangs or whatever, even in situation where that is out of the picture because they're just not reachable from a local level, probably barely approachable from any level, there are still things that can be done, as I think also some of the other colleagues hinted to, at the very basic community level in terms of just making things a little bit less really bad. I mean, this is not about asking for the perfect world. It's about the work we saw white helmets do in Aleppo, about trying to at least make a rescue attempt, even during the harshest bombardments. And I think there is, not always, but in most cases I know of, there is scope for this, supporting people to explore what's the best bad idea sometimes, but maybe it is better to do that than doing nothing. So without knowing exactly what context you are thinking of, I think I'll have to leave it there. Thanks.
No problem at all. Thank you very much, Nils. We have actually a very similar question, a related one. I'd like to pose this to Rasmus so we can, just keep the discussion rolling. It is a challenging, challenging to take some of these questions out of context. So perhaps Rasmus will have, if we're lucky, some example to bring. This question is from Anieth, who writes as follows: "How do humanitarian agents try to mitigate conflict inflicted by the state governments on its own people, civilians, especially when that particular state government is preventing humanitarian actors to penetrate or to come in to help such victims?" So again, a related question. I'll throw that over to you, Rasmus. See what we can do.
Yeah, thanks. This is a really good question and a key challenge, of course. This shouldn't be done, of course, because it's according to international law, people's right to receive assistance. So it should, in an ideal world, as Niels also pointed to, be possible to do something and especially give people the necessary humanitarian aid. And I would also like to stress what Niels also touched upon a bit, that perhaps we are almost a bit critical to ourselves sometimes by thinking that we should solve some of these problems, and these are huge problems that can hardly be solved by our sector, unfortunately. But we should. I think it's a duty still to do as much as we can to mitigate the effects of this wrongdoing. And let me see if I can come up with an example of how we can try at least to reach people in situations where authorities may not be very keen on having humanitarian actors on the ground. And I'm thinking of, for example, the northern parts of Syria that saw extensive bombardment of towns and cities. And people trapped in these cities for extended periods of time without any real possibility to protect themselves or even escape. So we have tried to implement this conflict preparedness and protection project also in those parts of the country by working with local NGOs that have access to these parts and train teams that can go around in communities and at least help people to do the minimum to protect themselves, and building, of course, on what people already do implement. Because I think it's important also to acknowledge that in most of these circumstances, people will already have some ways, improvised ways of protecting themselves, and that we can perhaps reinforce, strengthen, or support, so that the situation is at least a bit less bad, as Niels also pointed to. Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you very much for that, Rasmus. So now I'd like to turn to Helen. I have a question from Ephraim, and it's on a similar theme, but changing context here. So Helen, I wonder what you would have to say in response to Ephraim. He writes, in Northeast Nigeria, there are times when the local or community security forces are accused of perpetrating protection concerns like SGBV. How would you handle a situation like this, especially when the community loses trust in local security structures? Over to you, Helen.
Thank you for this wonderful question. So what I would say here is what we have done in our own capacity of supporting such scenarios is building the capacity through dialogue, through inclusive and participatory dialogue between the communities and those local security providers, and then also identifying the needs to build their capacity with regards to informing them to understand those protective laws in place against violations of such SGBVs. And we also try to strengthen the capacity of the community to also understand their own responsibility with regards to such actions, because most of the times in some of the cases, you find out that those victims of SGBV, one way or the other, they have been enticed, like they don't have other means of survival, and then they are being cajoled to follow those security providers, and that has escalated the situation. So through inclusive dialogue processes between the security providers and the communities to understand vis-a-vis their actions.
Great. Thanks so much, Helen. Very much appreciated indeed. Now, there are a lot of additional questions, but I think we'd better move on to our next section so that we don't run into a time problem here. So now let's, and we'll of course try to bring those questions in a bit later. But for now, let's move on. And the overall idea of looking at these different approaches is, of course, to help others to learn from the experiences of all of your organizations. So I'd like to turn to our speakers again now, go around the panel to ask what others can learn from them, if you can distill a few lessons. So turning first back to you, Nils. What would be the main lessons that you would highlight to others in the humanitarian sector from the experience you've described to us? Over to you.
Look beyond your normal programming. Get out of the project box, really, and try to work in a manner where you can be led by what people prioritize themselves and the knowledge they have, and see where that leads you into a degree of ownership and sustainability in your program that might justify having to leave behind some of the silos and in some cases even some funding that's not flexible enough, because it may not even there's so much to be gained. So, but just shortly, I mean, as I said in the beginning, there's tons of documentation on how we work with SCLR in many different incarnations in different places, and you can find it on the websites. There's not tons, but quite a number of new resources. There's just been a guidance paper on the micro cash grant for groups worked out by a subgroup under the Cash Learning Network, under CALP. So I'd strongly encourage you to look at that, because I know for many NGOs, this idea of group cash grants sounds dangerous, sounds tricky, but there's a very solid guidance and tip sheets out now from CALP that should make it a lot easier for all of us to get that swing it by our own bosses and donors. What I see when you work like this and you allow yourself to be led more by citizens and communities is that you get a more proactive response, and you basically get a nexus response in practice, because their priorities will cut across survival, protection, livelihoods, whatever is most relevant right now as the situation develops. It doesn't need a big joint assessment mission and 3 months of analysis. No, we see these shifts in our program, in our way of working with communities, happening weeks and months before the industry, if you will allow me that term, manages to change gear and move from rapid search to, for instance, more recovery things. So I think there's so much to be learned from just opening up that much more equitable, collaborative space where you allow, but you can only do it if you're ready to allow ownership also of the resources, also over the decision-making to citizens and community groups with lots of guidance, etc. But there's so much to be won by doing that.
Great, thanks a lot, Nils. Next over to Cesar. Based on your experience in the DRC with community-based protection programming, what would be the main lessons that you would highlight to others? You have the floor, Cesar.
Merci pour la parole.
Thank you for passing me the floor. So the first lesson that I would share, linked to our experience, is the fact that we've always been confronted with a problem when it comes to authorities dealing with the local communities and the links between them. We are trying to work on skills building among the authorities so that they can really speak the same language as the communities. We want there to be a perception of the various threats at community level. We want them to be able to have this link, this relationship between them, so that they can really look at identifying risks with the local people. When it comes to actually implementing these relationships and these links, we see that there are some issues linked to the fact that authorities aren't really used to participating in community protection projects. They don't really have a very good idea of what we are doing within the community context. So the idea is to really start with a blank slate, if you like, with the authorities. How can we actually share with them our commitments, explain to them how our way of working actually functions? We felt that we have to really involve the authorities when it comes to really establishing these links and really looking at the various power holders within communities. So how do they identify who to establish links with? How do we actually create forums for this? How can we support them in maintaining these relationships so that they can have a real commitment at community level? So what do we actually look at when it comes to protection plans? How can we identify risks, and how can we actually have a round table with community members and authorities at local level to actually share these ideas? The second lesson I wanted to share with you is the fact that we have this exit plan method that we try to establish. So at the end of the real intense period of conflict, how do communities get themselves back on their feet? How do they actually share their ideas? How do they maintain their links with project staff and actually continue the work after the project itself has finished? Because of course these things do come to an end, and we have to actually try to ensure that there's a continuity to our work. So we've looked at how we can actually intervene in terms of setting up mechanisms for saving credit. So we call these village associations for savings and credits that we try to set up within the local communities to actually set people up to start saving, to start having an income. And we've seen that after our projects have actually come to an end, these initiatives can continue. There's a real interest in terms of continuing these associations and looking to develop them as well. So this has been a great lesson when it comes to actually giving people power to actually continue to organise this kind of work and to plan activities, protection activities within these associations, within the meetings that we set up. We feel that setting in motion this idea of actually meeting regularly, exchanging ideas regularly, this can actually continue the work and organise people's access to things like microcredit, etc. So when there is an issue, it means that people they have a better idea of where to turn, how to express their issues, and how this can be dealt with on a local level as well. Another element in terms of this lesson learning is when it comes to actually setting up these kinds of initiatives, the members of our various groups have actually gone forward to finance certain protection actions. They've been sharing alerts, systems. They've been also trying to set up programs to reimburse transport fees for people to attend meetings with authorities, etc. So there really is a support work going on now within the communities as well as with our staff and our partners. When we actually set up an exit plan with the communities at the beginning of a project, it really facilitates this rolling out of the project or the project objectives over time, so that our partners really continue our actions at community level. This makes it a long-term, sustainable initiative. So these exit plans have been really positive for our work, and we've seen real developments taking place at grassroots level, and people taking on a leadership role within communities and within these groups and associations. Then at the end of the project, we actually allow the communities to sort of take things over and continue to carry on with the activities and forge these partnerships within their local areas. This is what I wanted to say in terms of lessons to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cesar. Now turning to Rasmus, when looking at risk education, what can other humanitarian actors learn from NPA's experiences? Over to you.
Thank you very much. I would like to focus on two things, perhaps to my own sector, which is the mine action sector. I think, as we can see on the slides there, that risk education is more than a post-conflict activity. So it shouldn't be confined to the traditional approach that we see in mine action, but perhaps we should dare ask ourselves the question if there are ways to reduce those patterns of harm that we see from the use of explosive weapons in urban areas, also acknowledging that the vast majority of casualties from explosive weapons are due to incoming weapons and not mines and ERW, although they are very important as well, ERW being explosive remnants of war. But also I would like to mention something we actually touched upon last week for those who had the pleasure to listen to the other session that PEAP and NRC organized on the 23rd. We heard from Geneva Call and ICRC, and that was engaging with perpetrators, or sort of a policy perspective on this problem. And I think we have touched upon this today as well by saying that fundamentally there is something in the behavior of armed actors that needs to change, and we as a humanitarian sector can hardly make up for all of those wrongdoings in our programming. We can merely mitigate some of these effects. So it was always NPA's approach when it comes to protecting civilians from explosive weapons that we also need to work with this behavior and getting some of these weapons that kill and harm civilians simply banned. And we have been successful before with the mine ban treaty, the anti-personal mine ban treaty, and the conventional cluster munition. And those weapons bans, they came partly from an acknowledgement and very good data on the civilian harm that these weapons caused. So I think it's very important to collect this data and also work to change the behavior of those parties to conflict that tend to use weapons that have a particularly devastating effect on civilians. And just to add that we have recently achieved also a ban on nuclear weapons, and I think the motivation behind that ban was partly that there is no way that the humanitarian architecture can respond to the devastation caused by nuclear war. So they had to be avoided and never used. So we acknowledged from the get-go that the devastation is simply too large to respond to. So better never use them. And just to finish on urban warfare, the use of explosive weapons in such areas, NPA is working together with many other NGOs actually. Humanitarian Inclusion, Save the Children, and many others, to get states to sign a political declaration in which we ask them, at least, to avoid the use of explosive weapons that have wide area impacts in order to protect civilians better. It's not about outlawing or banning all explosive weapons, but it's simply about reducing the use or avoiding the use of those that have particularly devastating effects when used in populated areas. So yeah, thanks a lot. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Rasmus. And now turning to Helen. Helen, what can others learn from DRC's experiences in Northeast Nigeria? Over to you.
Okay, thank you. They can learn putting communities agency first by inclusive participatory dialogue to identify community concerns, looking at the sequencing of our programming, where we start with the community safety planning, and a lot of issues come out, and it informs the level of intervention and how should the intervention be done. And then critical and meaningful participation of women and youths, particularly those that have been affected by conflicts. Their concerns are not being taken into consideration or being heard. And then when engaging with security providers or key stakeholders that have to do with security issues, they should understand the needs for the concerns of the people in order for them to secure their commitments in protecting the general populace. And then focusing on concrete steps that can equip the marginalized groups so that they can know how they can be able to take the lead in addressing their own safety or security issues as it affects them.
Great. Thanks so much, Helen. Now, in our final section, we're going to briefly look at the systemic level, and unfortunately, very briefly. But there are some important questions here. How do these programs fit into the overall humanitarian architecture or the humanitarian ecosystem? Is the current humanitarian and protection architecture conducive to this kind of programming? And are there any changes needed to make it more effective? This is, of course, a big topic, but we did want to get some initial thoughts from our presenters today. So if you are able to keep it quite brief, then hopefully we will also have time for one more round of questions before we close. So let's start with you, Cesar. How well does your community-based programming in the DRC fit with the existing humanitarian architecture? Over to you.
Okay, merci.
Thank you very much. So at the moment, within our area of action, we have community humanitarian coordination, we have cluster protection and sub-cluster protection. So these various bodies facilitate the work of international, national and local organizations in the territory of Masisi. We have meetings set up, as I explained before, and we try, therefore, to actually involve these different levels and have a sharing of experiences between local and more international NGOs. We try to actually, therefore, share and coordinate our activities. Our community activities obviously go on at ground roots level, but they're often not really noticed when it comes to these meetings by humanitarian coordination or protection clusters and sub-clusters. So they kind of go unnoticed, and we need to actually try to raise awareness in terms of what's actually being organized at community level within local areas. Our solution, or one solution to this challenge, would be to establish an exchange framework on community protection, in which the achievements of communities, so the members of these community protection structures, would be taken into account. And this would allow humanitarian actors to know what the communities are doing at this local grassroots level. Community protection has proven its merits, but the approaches aren't necessarily harmonized. So we really do need this at a local level. We therefore have our recommendations that we're really trying to emphasize when it comes to the need to harmonize these approaches, so that each partner involved in a specific area of the country can really understand their own approach and the way that other people's approaches fit in to this and come together for something that's much more shared, much more harmonized between all those involved in a specific area. And that's what I wanted to say with regard to this question. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Cesar. Now, turning to Nils, what is the situation for the survivor and community-led crisis response? How does it fit in with the current humanitarian architecture? Nils has the floor.
Thanks. And I think I hope I can also address one of the questions from, I think it was Megan, around donor support, etc., for this way of working. So I mean, it's sort of a bit of a paradox. I mean, this SCLR way of working, survivor community-led crisis response, it ticks almost all of the current buzzwords: participation, localization, caste, transparency, resilience, protection, proactive action. It is Nexus. So what's not to like? Probably there's a bit too much. And in a funding system and in a coordination system where everything is siloed, the fact that this way of working can't be hemmed in, it's going to go the way people right now think is important. Probably is our biggest, this way of working, it's its biggest strength and its biggest weakness. Doesn't fit in any one cluster. I wouldn't want to go, to nail this into one cluster. What we are trying to work with in the communities is rather that they have their own peer level coordination, peer level experience exchange, etc. And then it's up to the national NGO, the local NGO, the INGO to link up to that cluster system, which you may sense that I do not necessarily think so highly of. But the link needs to be there. But we actually emphasize that peer learning, local authorities, linking up with them is much more important. So, but on the other hand, I also said there is certainly a growing interest in this way of working from donors. But I'd say I don't think donors necessarily are the biggest stumbling block. I think it's the self-understanding with all of us as professional aid workers and as international NGOs, to some extent also national NGOs, of being the ones who hold the answer, who can deliver the solution. That's blocking, stopping, truly, genuinely community-led activities picking up more than it is happening. But we are, as I say, we're certainly seeing both donors, national NGOs, internationals looking much more closely. And it's been a real joy to just listen in today to colleagues who are, I think many of the things we're proposing, we may call it slightly different names, but it's certainly all pointing in the same and from all our experience in the right direction about promoting local agency. Just the last thing that I found really entices donors, and that's when we can show and break down in number and data that, for instance, in recent interventions, collaborations in Gaza, with small cash grant interventions, community contributions to those cash grants were 3 times as high as what we brought to the party. And we are seeing this replicated in the most suppressed and poor parts of Myanmar or in Sudan, that whatever we might bring in terms of value, also money value, into these groups, they will double, triple, and sometimes even more than that. That's something that also impresses donors. So I think that is a point to look at and push and promote with donors, but also do it based on hard data when you can.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Nils. And yes, actually, we've had several questions, including from Megan and others on the donor point, and would love to hear as well from the other panelists, building on what you've been saying, Nils, or bringing any other perspective. So let's continue around. We're turning to Rasmus next to ask for the CPP. I guess particularly, are there any weaknesses in how the current humanitarian architecture is able to support this type of programming? Perhaps in addition to any other points you're going to make, Rasmus, if you're able to reflect a bit as well on the question of donors, to what extent donors, you find them to be responsive to this kind of flexible, fully community-led programming, that would be great to hear as well. So turning the floor over to you, Rasmus.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And thanks for taking the time also to discuss this important topic. We've been through a lot already, but I guess what I want to say here is that resilience is sort of a more accepted concept when we speak of natural disaster preparedness, disaster risk reduction, for example. There's always the topic of resilience that is mentioned, but not as much when we talk about armed conflict, although we do see a clear pattern of harm also here. So with conflicts that are reoccurring and the harm well known, it should also be possible to do something to build resilience, community resilience to conflict. And from the donor perspective, I guess they are used to risk education being mine risk education or explosive ordnance risk education, as we call it now. So that's the silo where risk education programming usually fits into. And that is what I mentioned earlier, happening after conflicts, but not taking into account very much before and during conflicts. So maybe that's a challenge we have experienced, how to make this fit into the current architecture. It's also perhaps a bit more difficult to measure, give like really tangible numbers on how much harm we prevented from this type of programming when we compare it to, for example, distributions of either cash or other goods, which probably is easier to come to a donor and then say that, look, this is how much we delivered from the money we got from you. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, terrific. Thank you very much. And now turning to Helen, how do you think that the humanitarian architecture could be strengthened in order to support the type of programming that you're carrying out in Northeast Nigeria? And again, Helen, if you, in addition to any other points that you would you like to make, feel free to jump in as well on the donor question too. So over to you, Helen.
Thank you. More conflict sensitivity approach as regards to how our intervention interacts with the given environment, to also understand the local dynamics, learning also from and adapting to the local context where we operate, and through collaborative approach in community safety approaches within which the humanitarian architecture needs to be strengthened so that we understand the communities, how they also contribute in regards to their own safety, and then capacity building to strengthen staff in conflict management and facilitation, so as to also engage on different platforms of dialogue, especially when it comes to the inclusive participatory approach, where we need communities to be open to share their experience, to share their concerns, so as it also informs our own learning and it also informs our own interaction as we implement activities within the community. And on the donor perspective, I would say it's good with the conflict sensitivity approach, looking at how we intend to engage in the conflict environment with the given existing current situation that they are already going through some forms of conflicts or issues in their community, and understanding how we can also engage with different actors within the community, not to be perceived negatively, but rather also trying to ameliorate the sufferings of the civilians in the conflict environment.
Great, thank you very much, Helen. So we've come almost to the end of our time now. I think we do have time for a very brief final tour around this virtual table for some concluding remarks. So just a few seconds each, but this is a good opportunity if there's anything else in the chat that you've seen or the Q&A that you'd like to pull out. Feel free to give a few seconds on that, or any other main takeaway that you would like to leave with the group today. Let's go around, starting with Cesar and then to Rasmus, Helen, and finally Nils. So Cesar, over to you for brief concluding remarks today.
Merci beaucoup pour la parole.
Thank you very much. So it was a real pleasure to participate to this webinar today. It was very good to share my experience, to listen also to the other partners here represented. And I heard some really good ideas that I hope I will be able to implement, such as the Conflict Preparedness and Protection Program. So, to conclude, the work that we've implemented with the advocacy group is very important as well, because we can find solutions to problems, even more when these problems are not resolved by the individual. So you really need to reach out to the people who have the authority. And this is really about this good advocacy, raising awareness, and including all the different stakeholders in the different entity structures. It's very important because we've managed to, in one single structure, gather 10 different stakeholders. And that's very important to create this synergy, because that's how you can identify solutions at the local, provincial level. And we also now trying to attract and engage provincial authorities in these meetings, because sometimes you have to solve local problems at the local level, but sometimes you need to be able to escalate and go to the provincial level, and we can find solutions. And I think that's really good when you manage to find a solution for all the members of the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Cesar, and thanks so much for joining the event today. It's been very valuable to have your perspective and hear from your experiences, so thank you very much. Now turning to Rasmus for brief concluding remarks. You have the floor.
Yeah, thanks. Let me be very brief, and thank you so much for having addressed this topic today. I would just like to conclude by saying that, as we know, we no longer consider all victims of natural disaster as inevitable consequences of such forces of nature. We should also not consider all victims of war and violent conflict as inevitable consequences of brutalities of conflict. We should always ask ourselves if we could do something to protect these people. I'm sorry I couldn't answer all the questions today, but please feel free to reach out in the aftermath of this event by Googling my name and NPA. You will probably find my email address, and I'll be happy to engage in the discussion. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks so much to you and for your time today and for mentioning the aftermath of the event. Indeed, I hope that we'll be able to continue the discussion. There's so much left to say and so many more questions. We'll be posting those in the PHAP community and hopefully pick them all up there. So thanks again, Rasmus. Now turning to Helen for brief concluding remarks. You have the floor.
All right, thank you. It's a pleasure to have participated, to present what DRC is doing in Northeast Nigeria, and to also hear and learn from others from different approaches as how we protect community-based promoting community-based protection for conflict-affected communities. And I would like to also encourage participatory dialogue processes at grassroots level to be more inclusive and participatory, as that also helps to give the room for communities to also share concerns, things that are not being seen or are not being seen visible, but we listen through their concerns and emotions through a dialogue process. Thank you. And for the questions that I've not been able to address now, I'll also try to put in some comments in the chat box as well. Thank you.
That's perfect. Thank you very much, Helen, for taking the time to join today. Really, really appreciated. And last but not least, Nils, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot. It's been a real privilege. thanks also to all of those of us who didn't get a chance to speak. We were a privileged few, but thanks a lot for your time and you listening into this. I think in conclusion, I think this has shown, and it's not the first time I sit with that sense that we have to kind of understand that truly working with citizens and community-led responses in an odd way is a speciality in itself. And it should, as somebody else said earlier, it should really be seen, coordinated, managed, and funded on its own merits, instead of being a little bit like that kid that there's no seat for at the table, at the donor table, nor at the cluster table, it probably needs its own kind of just a squappy little chair. We don't need a comfy chair, but just a squappy little thing that'll keep us alert, but to be basically seen on its own merits. And I think it can enrich also a lot of the mainstream programming, because it just sets a dynamic in motion, which is great. Reach out. I posted the Local to Global's website, send an email there. I might take a few days off over Easter, sorry, but eventually we'll try to get back to you. Thanks a lot to everyone and my fellow panelists. Ciao.
Thank you, Nils, and thanks once again to all of you for being a part of this discussion today. Thanks to all of the participants as well for taking active part. And again, we'll hope that the discussion will continue. So now I'll just wrap things up. I'd like to mention that a recording of today's event will be available in both video and audio only podcast format that will be online within the next few days. And if you missed the first session of the series, which took place last week, you can find a recording of that already on the event page available for viewing. And while this is the end of this two-part series, you can continue the discussion, as we've mentioned, in the PHAP community. I would recommend that you log in straight away now to share your main takeaways from this session and to share also your recommendations to colleagues that maybe you didn't have a chance yet to share in the event. My colleagues will be also sharing the link to the discussion thread here in the chat, so you can go straight over there. And as mentioned, and as several of our speakers have also indicated, we will be following up to see if we can actually address some of the questions, specific questions that came in that we weren't able to bring up on the air, as it were. So we will hopefully be able to follow those up as well and post responses in the community so that we can keep those rolling. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone once again, panelists and participants, for a very interesting discussion, and we look forward to being in touch again very soon. This is Ingrid Lang from PHAP signing off from Geneva. Bye-bye.